So all this should be quite easy. The hardness well value should be straightforward. So let's look at analysis. Anyone? Ying, come project your calculation. You done that, Ying? Mr. Chua, have you done it? Desmond, have you done it? Oh, you haven't. Okay. So all right, let's not waste time because I've got a few videos for you to watch here. So this is a hardness value C scale. So I've given you the data. So add up and then average them out here. So comparatively, you can compare shortest will be. Let's look at the data that you have here on there, just by a numerical value. All right. This is as received sample. This HR here. So the value you got in the lab 2 is a B, this is C scale, so it's the same. So this is as received. All right, so you can see from here, the higher the hardness, all right, the higher the value as recorded. So in here, this is the hardest. Second hardest is normalized. That will be annealing. So annealing sample purpose is to soften. Soften means you should get a lower hardness. All right, so therefore the value reflected in here is quite justifiable. And so you can see from here, this is this normalized, this is for the hardened sample value. Okay, so this is how you write your discussion. Follow, Ken? So following this here, you have your impact value. Impact value, you can see from here, this is only energy here. So you have to divide, you have to find CIV. CIV, go back to your lab manual. So CIV is the formula in here. So I've given to you is impact value, energy. So if you want to find CIV, this one is CIV, C full stop I, full stop B. So you have to divide by cross sectional area. So your cross sectional area is 10 times 10 because it's a bar. Recall back using bar sample. So this is already measured in the prerequisite video. So should be able to get the CIV value here. So by this, you just look at your data by means of the value. So again, this is reflected. All right. Okay, Ken? Follow? So the microstructure, I've given you something additional. So because here is quite small, you can't see clearly. So this one you can use back lab 4, lab 2 as received sample. Medium number still. So for microstructure, this one will be posted to you later. So if it's a new sample, right, by now you should know roughly maybe 0.1% what it means by anneal heat treatment, meaning that you let the sample to be cool in furnace. You don't take it out from the furnace, you just turn off the power supply to the furnace, disconnect it. So what you have here, this is the microstructure, you get cost per light. So draw, you can draw like that. Okay, you still can see laminar structure here. So normalized sample, which means ACO, you get fine per light. So this is your schematic diagram. Are you clear? Schematic drawing, manual drawing by your hand. Because the one you have here is pretty small, you probably can't see. I'll give you this as a support here. This is not, all right? Okay. Any question? Let me check. Sorry, any question there, guys? Can you follow? So this is the last report. Yeah, it's going to be quite taxing. Everything coming together. So try your best. So we have here, you can schematically draw this anneal sample, normal sample. So if we go to the lab manual, what do you need to write? Recall back. Here doesn't have it. This one has it. Grain size. This is lab 6. Look at lab 5. It's also the same. You also have this ask in the lab 5 here. Just recap back. They don't have. Sorry. Okay. Lab 6. I thought they have. Oh, it's here. Okay, sorry, it's here. It's here. You have one. So this one will be you can tell me cos. This is fine, and this is sorry, wrong column. Yes, correct column. Um, what you have here. Sorry, this is for this. This is for this. Then this is for this here. So you can give me a needle light structure. There's no grain size particularly. You can't measure the size there for quench sample because what you have here is multi-site. Okay, multi-site here will be for normalize for light, fine for light. Here will be cos for light. And this one here is alpha for right and for light. Like what you did in lab 2. Follow? Yeah? Follow? So in here same?
Miss,
Yes.
you just need to tell what grain size is it. No need to draw.
No need to draw. Drawing is in the microstructure there.
So
So
from the table it shows before and after.
no
You already
need.
tell before.
Only before. Before is the same for all because it's only one sample ma. So you draw this only. Boleh? You draw only 4.
4. And then the grain size, we mentioned 3 only, no before and after.
Grain size no need don't need before. Before here will be as received lah.
Okay.
As received is you don't need to justify cost of finding it. So thanks for your question. Alright. Sorry if I confuse you. Then so this one is normalized. This one is annual. This one is bench. Boleh? So this is your diagram. As received is same as before for all the sample because it's the same sample. So you only draw after this is diagram 1. That's diagram 1. What's diagram 1? This one. Boleh? Yeah? So this is diagram 2 because if you can't see, in case you can't see, this is diagram 2. That's my diagram 3. Diagram 3 is here. Yeah. So you can't draw everything. You can see you cannot see grain one, not clear features of grain boundary here as compared from here. Here you can still see this is like one grain, right? This is like another grain. You can see the alignment, the orientation is slightly different one. Okay, all right. So this is what you can draw lah. So this is a needle light structure here. I'll show you later. Got video how you draw and sketch schematic drawing here. Okay, okay. So this will be diagram 3. So this one is from your lab to respect. Follow? Can So for lab 6, which is only the hardness, sorry, the chopping value. So the rest just fill up here. The rest is already provided. So your case here don't have beta, only have alpha. So if you are smart, if you have got the value here, if you want I'm not asking you to do that because you got the energy So you work back, find my beta if you want to. It's optional. Alright. So other group I give them the beta. I managed to find some beta. Okay. But then it's not critical. As long as you know beta is what? Angle after impact. Alpha is what? 136.5. That's for all. Boleh ya? Can? On your microphone, ask me really. So that I know you're asking question there. So let's look at here. Next one, let's look at some video. Right, video to show you what exactly is heat treatment. So I hope from here you can follow through.
Steel metallurgy. Steel is the widest used metal, but what constitutes a steel? How can we affect the properties? And what happens during the solidification of steel? These are a few key insights that we will try to Steel metallurgy. Steel is the widest used metal, but what constitutes a steel? How can we affect the properties? And what happens during the solidification of steel? These are a few key insights that we will try to uncover in this module. Steel is primarily iron with up to 1% carbon plus other alloying additions. In the majority of steels, this alloying addition generally totals less than 5%, but in some steels, this can be as great as 50%. A steel composition can be thought of as a recipe. Different amounts of each ingredient make up your final product. In steel, these ingredients are known as alloying additions. Each addition affects the properties of the steel in a different way. Depending on the amount and type of alloying additions added, we can affect the following properties in a different way. Strength, the ability to withstand load in tension. Hardness, the ability to resist plastic deformation, usually via penetration, also described as resistance to scratching or abrasion. Toughness, the ability to absorb energy. Ductility, the ability to deform without fracture. Fatigue, the weakening of metal caused by repeatedly applied load. Formability, the ease in which metal can be molded into the final product. Machinability, the ease in which metal can be processed into the final product with cutting tools. Weldability, the ease in which metal can be joined. Corrosion, the ability to withstand chemical reaction through oxidation. To affect the steel in this manner, a wide variety of elements can be added. These include carbon, silicon, manganese, phosphorus, sulfur, chromium, molybdenum, nickel, aluminium, niobium, also called columbium, titanium, vanadium, copper, boron, nitrogen, tungsten, cobalt. Carbon. Carbon is the most important element for strength and hardness. As the level of carbon is increased, the tensile strength and hardness also increases. Carbon is a cheap way of increasing the strength, and it is essential for the formation of microstructures. Phosphorus. Phosphorus is usually classed as an impurity as it significantly reduces the toughness and ductility of a steel, but it can be used as a solid solution strengthener. This is explained later in this module. Sulfur. Sulfur is usually classed as an impurity as it reduces the steel's ductility, toughness, and weldability. Sulfur can form with iron to produce a low melting point impurity called iron sulfide. This can collect along grain boundaries and cause the steel to break up during hot working. This is called hot shortness. Sulfur is sometimes added to steel to aid machinability. Manganese. Manganese has a great effect on hardenability and can be found in most commercial steels. Manganese can strengthen the steel through solid solution strengthening, which is explained later in this module. It also combines with sulfur to prevent hot shortness. Chromium. Chromium increases the hardenability of steel. It can join together with carbon to form very stable carbides, which are excellent for wear and abrasion resistance. It is used in high levels in stainless steels for corrosion resistance. It does this by creating a protective oxide film on the surface of the stainless steel. Molybdenum. Molybdenum also increases the hardenability of steels. When combined with chromium and nickel, it has a strong multiplicative effect on hardenability. It is both in alloy and stainless steels. Nickel. Nickel, as with chromium and molybdenum, increases the hardenability of steel and can increase the toughness of steels, particularly at low temperatures. Again, it is present in large amounts in stainless steels. Silicon. Silicon is mainly used to remove oxygen from steel in a process called deoxidation. The removal of oxygen in steel is important as oxygen can form voids in steel known as blowholes and porosity. Oxygen can also combine with other elements to form brittle particles, known as oxides. Silicon can be used to increase the fluidity when casting steels. Aluminium. Aluminium is primarily used to deoxidize the steel. It can combine with nitrogen to form nitrides, which can restrict grain growth. Niobium. Niobium, also called columbium, in small amounts can increase yield strength, tensile strength, and toughness. Vanadium. Vanadium is used to increase the hardenability and toughness of steels through its ability to restrict grain growth. Boron. Boron can significantly increase the hardenability of steels and can enhance the effect of other alloying elements. Nitrogen. Nitrogen is often added in combination with other elements to form nitrides. These nitrides increase the hardness and tensile strength, but at the expense of toughness and ductility. When we add alloying elements, they do not always work in isolation. Sometimes the elements work in conjunction and can cause a multiplication effect that would not be expected from the sum of the individual additions. For example, both chromium and molybdenum may be added individually to a steel in order to strengthen it, but a small amount of molybdenum used in conjunction with chromium will result in a much greater strengthening effect than using one of the elements alone. The addition of carbon to iron is probably the most important addition in cast irons and steels. This makes a diagram called the iron-carbon equilibrium diagram very useful. Equilibrium means that enough time has been allowed on heating and cooling for any reactions to fully complete. Many of the basic features of this diagram influence the behavior of the most complex steel alloys. The diagram is used to understand what structures will be formed at what temperatures and at what carbon contents. We can also see at what temperature different compositions melt, and we can calculate how much liquid and solid will be present at a given temperature, and can see when a steel will be fully solid. We can also calculate how much of each structure or phase will be present at a given temperature. On the diagram there are several points of interest. A1, the temperature at which austenite turns to pearlite. Below this temperature, austenite, gamma iron, does not exist. This is 723 degrees Celsius. A3, the temperature when ferrite, alpha iron, transforms to austenite, gamma iron. For pure iron, this occurs at 910 degrees Celsius, but lowers in temperature along the line to 0.8% carbon. Then it increases in temperature up to 2% carbon. Liquidus temperature, the temperature at which steel of a given composition fully turns to a liquid. Below 723 degrees Celsius, we can see Fe3C, which is iron carbide. This is called cementite, which is a ceramic compound of iron and carbon. Steels with less than 0.8% carbon consist of a structure of ferrite and pearlite. Pearlite is a structure that consists of iron carbide, cementite, and ferrite alpha iron in parallel laths. Above 0.8% carbon, cementite and pearlite are primary constituents. If we take an example of a 0.3% carbon steel, the steel is molten until we cool to 1510 degrees Celsius. At this point, the liquid iron starts to solidify into delta iron. From 1510 to 1495 degrees Celsius, the amount of delta iron increases while the amount of liquid decreases. At 1495 degrees Celsius, the body-centered cubic delta iron transforms to face-centered cubic austenite. As we continue to cool to 1454 degrees Celsius, the amount of austenite increases and the liquid decreases until we have a fully solid austenitic structure. As we decrease in temperature further, the structure remains austenite until we hit 820 degrees Celsius, where it starts to form body-centered cubic ferrite. From 820 to 723 degrees Celsius, the amount of austenite decreases and the amount of ferrite increases until the remainder of the austenite will transform. But as austenite has a higher solubility for carbon than ferrite, the ferrite that forms will not be able to accommodate all the carbon that was contained in the austenite, and thus, the remaining austenite will form a mixture of ferrite, alpha iron, and iron carbide, cementite. This structure is known as pearlite. Here we can see some examples of different carbon contents and the structures produced. Low carbon. Structure consists primarily of ferrite with small grains of pearlite. Medium carbon. Structure consists primarily of pearlite with a small percentage of ferrite. High carbon. At 0.8% carbon, the structure consists pearlite. Above 0.8% carbon, the structure consists of pearlite and cementite. In addition to the iron-carbon equilibrium diagram, there are two other diagrams that are used extensively in metallurgy. These are the CCT, Continuous Cooling Transformation Diagram, and the TTT, Time Temperature Transformation Diagram. We briefly outlined these in this module, and will go into these in a greater depth in a following module on heat treatment, where these are primarily used. While the iron-carbon diagram describes the structures of steel under equilibrium conditions, where enough time has been allowed on heating and cooling for any reactions to fully complete, both the continuous cooling transformation and time temperature transformation diagrams allow determination of structures at various cooling rates, from slow to very fast. Both these diagrams are helpful in selecting the optimum steel and process parameters to achieve a given set of properties. Continuous cooling transformation diagrams are generally more appropriate for engineering applications. The diagrams show the structures that are achievable continuously cooling from the austenitization temperature at a constant rate. These diagrams often show the structure that can be achieved at the center of different sized bars for cooling in water, oil, and air. Some diagrams also have the hardness that is achieved from this structure. Time temperature transformation diagrams show how long it would take for a structure to be achieved by holding at a given temperature. This diagram allows you to plot varying cooling rates and show the structure that would be achieved. Hardenability. In metallurgy, the hardenability of a steel is a key parameter, and when we talk about hardenability in steels, we are often describing how deep into the steel we can achieve hardening. If a steel is described as having a low hardenability, this will mean that the steel will produce a shallower depth of hardness. When a steel has a high hardenability, it will be the same hardness throughout the thickness of the product. Highly hardenable steels are more important in large components. Hardenability is not to be mistaken for hardness. When describing the hardness, we are often looking at the microstructure achieved during cooling. For a given steel, it can be assumed that the quicker the cooling rate, the greater chance of achieving a harder structure, and if that steel has a high hardenability, this hard structure will be present deeper into the thickness. We can increase the hardenability of a steel by adding elements like manganese, molybdenum, chromium, nickel, and boron. When we add these elements, it increases the hardenability, and this will enable us to achieve a harder structure deeper into the thickness. The ability of the hardness to go deeper into the thickness is because it is easier to achieve a harder structure at a slower cooling rate. The structure of a steel can be pearlite with ferrite or cementite, which is the softer structure, martensite, which is the harder structure, and bainite, which is in between. Looking at the continuous cooling transformation diagram, if a steel has a low hardenability, ferrite and pearlite transformation will be shown in the upper left-hand side of the diagram, meaning it will be difficult or even impossible to form martensite. If a steel has high hardenability, transformation to martensite will be shown at the bottom right-hand side of the diagram, meaning that a steel will fully transform to martensite over a large range of thicknesses. Strengthening mechanisms. In the Introduction to Materials module, we talked about dislocations being present in metals. These dislocations reduce the strength of the metal. The principle of strengthening mechanisms is to reduce the ability of these dislocations to move through the metal. This can be achieved by the reduction in grain size, cold working, solid solution strengthening, and dispersion or precipitation strengthening. These strengthening mechanisms can be applied individually or in combination. In metal, it is estimated that there are 10 million to 1 billion dislocations per centimeter squared, and each dislocation has a strain field associated with it. With grain size, the grains can interact with the dislocations, preventing further movement of them. If we reduce the grain size, we can increase the number of grains interacting with the dislocations, preventing their movement and thus strengthening the metal. Cold work introduces a large amount of strain into the metal. This strain interacts with the dislocation's strain field, impeding the movement of the dislocations. Solid solution strengthening is applied when we add other chemical elements to a metal. As discussed in the Introduction of Materials module, the elements added can either fall between the atoms of the bulk material or replace the atoms. Within steel, carbon atoms fall between iron atoms and nickel atoms replace iron atoms. This will either be called interstitial or substitutional solid solution strengthening and will cause distortion in the atomic structure. This distortion interacts with the dislocations, preventing the dislocation movement and strengthening the steel. Dispersion or precipitation strengthening is highly related to the structure of the metal and takes place when a phase is finely precipitated through a softer matrix. This hard precipitate acts as a barrier to dislocation movement. The precipitates can also produce a strain field that interacts with the dislocation strain field. So, in summary, we have the ability to tailor the properties of a steel by adding different alloying elements. Alloying elements do not always work in isolation, sometimes they cause a multiplication effect. Carbon to iron is probably the most important addition to cast irons and steels. The iron-carbon equilibrium diagram, continuous cooling transformation diagram, and time temperature transformation diagram are the most widely used diagrams in steel metallurgy. Continuous cooling transformation and time temperature transformation diagrams allow determination of structures at a variation of cooling rates. Hardenability describes how deep into the steel we can achieve hardening. Hardenability is not to be mistaken for hardness. When describing the hardness, we are often looking at the structure achieved from cooling. The structure of a steel can be pearlite with ferrite or cementite, which is the softer structure, martensite, which is the harder structure, and bainite, which is in between. Dislocations reduce the strength of the metal. The principle of strengthening mechanisms is to reduce the ability of these dislocations to move through the steel. Strengthening can be achieved by the reduction in grain size, cold working, solid solution strengthening, and dispersion or precipitation strengthening.
All right. Any question? So this is a recap of what exactly is a N carbon phase diagram. What do you see as the temperature A3, A1, ACM from the diagram of N carbon phase diagram here. So let's go on to the next video.
A very important topic in engineering is the heat treatment of steels. We have looked at steels. Let us look at now what is meant by heat treatment. To motivate our topic, let us look at 5 different, suppose we are supplied with 5 different samples of steel. So let's just call them steel A, B, C, D, and E. Now, suppose these steels are supplied to us and we want to test their property. One simple mechanical property of any given steel is what is called the hardness. And hardness is a simple test in which all you have to do is to prepare a nice flat surface of your specimen, and in that you then press some sort of indenter, some sort of hard indenter made of diamond or hardened steel, and you press the indenter through some load. So this is an indenter. This is your sample. An indenter is pressed into the sample through the load. The resulting, after, if there is sufficient load to press it hard such that there is a depression or indentation is created in the specimen, that is, the specimen is plastically deformed. So even after the specimen is removed, even after the indenter is removed, there will be a depression left. That's called an indentation. And either the depth or the diameter, so let us say depth h or the diameter d of the specimen, of the indentation, that is the size of the indentation, then gives us the idea of the hardness of the specimen. You can intuitively see that if the specimen is harder, the indentation left for a given load and indenter will be smaller. So smaller the indentation, harder is the specimen. And depending on what shape of indenter we use conical indenter or pyramidal indenter or spherical indenter and so on. So depending on what kind of indenter we use and what load we use, different kind of hardness scales have been developed. So suppose we send our steels A to E to laboratory and test them in some scale. So let us say that we are measuring their hardness in a Rockwell C scale. So hardness, and our hardness scale is hardness in Rockwell C. So that is one of the scales of hardness, HRC. Hardness in Rockwell hardness in C scale. So let's not worry at the moment that exactly what load and indenter is used, but for a given Rockwell C means a specific kind of load is being used and a specific indenter is being used, and that is same for all these steels. So that is kept constant, but then the impression left in the different steels may be different, and that will indicate their different hardness. So you get a number which is called the Rockwell hardness. Now, if we do that, we find that A has a Rockwell hardness of 15, B has a Rockwell hardness of 30, C 45, D 55, and E 65. I'm just making up these numbers. Essentially, I want to say that the hardness is continuously increasing as we go down in this table, so that E is more than 4 times harder than A. So suppose we make this measurement and we find these hardnesses. What can we guess about these 5 steels? So if we go by, if you remember to the moment our iron carbon diagram, you recall that we studied the iron carbon diagram in detail, and we said that it was the lower portion of the iron carbon diagram which was of interest to us. The y-axis is temperature axis. This is 910. This is 725, and the x-axis is weight % carbon. So this is 0.02, very low carbon, and this is the so-called eutectoid composition with 0.8 weight % carbon. So this was our iron carbon diagram. The
Welcome back
phases
to Harbour Unboxed.
were
Now, first things first, today's massive
gamma,
benchmark
or
video
austenite.
is sponsored by us. We have some massive benchmark video
Then alpha,
is sponsored by description.
which is
Now,
ferrite.
onto the matter at hand. For those of you who missed it, last week I revisited the battle between the current generation $400
this region is
GPUs, the
alpha
Radeon
plus
RX
gamma.
5700
We
XT
call the
and
1-to-1 rule.
GeForce RTX 20
This
Super.
region is gamma.
Despite new drivers, games, and game updates, I found a very similar situation to what we encountered 7 months ago, that being a slight performance advantage going the way of the Radeon GPU. Despite offering a 15% performance uplift in about half a dozen of the games tested, the 5700 XT came out just 8% faster on average. Still, it was very clear that for the majority of games, the Radeon GPU would be the superior performer. Actually, coming away from that video, 2 things were clear. Many of you wanted an update between the 5700 XT and the more expensive 2070 Super, as well as the inclusion of DLSS results for games that supported the new and improved DLSS 2.0. So in today's video, we're going to include both of those things. In addition to the 2070 Super, I've also added the original RTX 2070 as that model was also heavily requested. Then we'll have the DLSS results for the 2060 Super, 2070 and 2070 Super in Control and Wolfenstein Youngblood. Once again for testing, we have 35 games, and as usual, we'll be taking a close look at the results for a dozen of the games tested and then jump into a 35 game performance breakdown. All testing has been conducted using our Core i9 9900K GPU test system clocked at 5 GHz with 16 GB of DDR4 3400 memory. As for the resolutions, we're covering 1080p and 1440p, but the focus of this discussion will be on the 1440p data. Okay, let's get into the results. First up, we have the Call of Duty Modern Warfare results, and this was a clear win for the 5700 XT over the 2060 Super, as it offered 22% more frames at 1440p. Now, even when compared to the 2070 Super, the 5700 XT is the superior performer, though this time by just a 5% margin, but still, that is a truly impressive result for AMD given how much cheaper the Radeon GPU is. The 2070 Super is able to pull ahead in Ghost Recon Breakpoint, making it 7% faster than the 5700 XT at 1440p, though it is worth noting that the 1% low performance was quite a bit better. Here the GeForce GPU was 16% faster, so a solid result for the 2070 Super, but it is worth noting that it does cost 25% more, so while the performance is certainly very good, the value isn't amazing, at least in this title. The 5700 XT and 2070 Super are neck and neck in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, delivering 87 FPS on average at 1440p, so a tremendously positive result for the Red Team. The RTX 2070 and 2060 Super are also neck and neck, and it appears as though the increased clock frequency for the 2060 Super makes up for it having a few less cores. Performance was competitive in Gears 5, here the 5700 XT edged ahead at 1080p, while the 2070 Super managed to push itself into the lead at 1440p by a very slim margin. So this is yet another title where the Radeon GPU punches well above its weight class. Moving on to Control, this is one of the games with DLSS 2.0 support, and we'll check those results out soon. For now though, here are the native 1080p and 1440p results. As we found last week, the 5700 XT only just manages to edge out the 2060 Super in control, and as a result, this meant the 2070 Super is 16% faster at 1440p, which admittedly still doesn't quite justify the 25% increase in price, but perhaps enabling DLSS will help here. And again, we'll look at that a little later on in the video. Next up, we have Metro Exodus, and here the 5700 XT easily beat the 2060 Super, in fact by so much that it's able to match the 2070 Super. Technically, the Radeon GPU does perform better in this title with more consistent frame time performance. For whatever reason, the 2070 Super struggled to improve upon the 1% low result of the standard 2070 and 2060 Super. Now, for the Resident Evil 3 results, and here the 2070 Super is able to edge out the 5700 XT, beating it by a 7% margin at 1440p, and it has to be said, single-digit gains really aren't very impressive given the price difference. In fact, here the 5700 XT performs much closer to the 2070 Super than it does the 2060 Super, so while Nvidia does get the win, this really is still a great result for AMD. Nvidia puts up a more convincing fight in Doom Eternal, beating the 5700 XT with the 2070 Super by a 21% margin. Basically, the Radeon GPU was only able to match the 2060 Super, so this handed Nvidia a pretty easy win with their $100 US more expensive GPU. Another game where the 5700 XT only managed to match the 2060 Super is Fortnite using the DirectX 12 mode. Here both GPUs averaged around 90 FPS, and that meant the 2070 Super was 17% faster, averaging just over 100 FPS. Another Battle Royale game where the Radeon performance is a bit iffy is PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. In fact, frame rates for the 5700 XT relative to the GeForce competition are actually much worse in this title. Still, despite all that, the 2070 Super was just 21% faster, and while on its own that is a rather large margin, remember, again, Nvidia's charging 25% more. Borderlands 3 has become an AMD special, much like what we saw with Forza Horizon 4 for quite some time. It's a major outlier in our testing, but the results are accurate. Here the 5700 XT is a whopping 32% faster than the 2060 Super, and still 13% faster than the 2070 Super. So whatever optimization work the developer or AMD has been doing for the Radeon GPUs, it's clearly working. Finally, we have Battlefield 5, and here the 5700 XT is able to match the 2070 Super with an average of 100 FPS at 1440p. So again, great performance from the $400 Radeon GPU, and those are stellar frame rates for a title that looks so good at 1440p. Okay, so the Radeon RX 5700 XT certainly looked as though it was holding its own against the GeForce RTX 2070 Super. Last time out, the Radeon GPU was 6% slower at 1440p, so it'll be interesting to see if that margin has changed in a meaningful way. Oh, and remember, for all the graphs that we didn't just cover, you can grab them for free over on our Patreon page, so yeah, link for that will be in the video description. Let's first take a look at the 1080p data, and here we see the 5700 XT is still 6% slower than the 2070 Super, suffering its biggest losses in The Outer Worlds, War Thunder, Vermintide 2, Doom Eternal, and PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. But it does see very strong performance in Borderlands 3, Dirt Rally 2.0, and Metro Exodus. It's also worth noting that for 15 of the 35 games tested, the margin is 5% or less, so overall there's really not much in it, as the 6% slower on average would suggest. The margin just seen at 1080p changes by just a percent at 1440p, and now the 5700 XT is just 7% slower, so basically the same margin that was seen 7 months ago. There's been some changes to the games used for testing, and the margins in quite a few of the titles have also changed, but at the end of the day, we end up with a very similar result. But what if we enable DLSS in Control and Wolfenstein Youngblood? Right, so enabling DLSS in Control, we see some pretty massive gains, and please note this is the quality DLSS mode, as we're running the highest possible resolution at 1440p. Frame rates for the 2070 Super were improved by 66% and 60% for the 2060 Super. This means the 2060 Super is now 48% faster than the 5700 XT, while the 2070 Super is a truly impressive 93% faster. Given we're talking about comparable image quality here between the 5700 XT and 2070 Super using DLSS, that's a devastating result for AMD. The only problem for Nvidia and their customers right now being that just 4 games support DLSS 2.0,
This video
and
is
we're
on
testing.
introducing the iron carbon phase diagram to you, as in how do you enhance the strength of steel in general. All right. So anything to ask me, you just stop. Sorry, you just on your microphone and ask. I will stop the YouTube video and then I will answer you. Can you do that? All right. Don't be shy. Anything here. All right. Okay.
Microstructures. So, for example, steel A has coarse pearlite. From the phase diagram chapter, when we saw the iron carbon phase diagram, you remember we met with pearlite. Pearlite was nothing but a mixture of alpha and Fe3C produced by cooling of austenite. So when austenite cooled, when gamma of 0.8% carbon was cooled through this eutectoid temperature, which is 725 degrees Celsius, we got a mixture of alpha and Fe3C. This mixture was named perlite. The microstructure of perlite, we said, was alternate lamellae of alpha and Fe3C.
Guys, you see how the professor used his pen to draw manually the structure. So this is how you can actually follow through. And the first video you saw, they also have some schematic diagram. So I have one more whole video on a drawing of a microstructure by manual. So you don't have to exactly draw as what you see, which is what I given to you earlier on here in the PDF version. So you just draw according to the lamellar structure of perlite, which is alternating cementite and alpha ferrite. Right.
Alternate lamellae of alpha and Fe3C is what is called perlite. So, and when we say coarse perlite, we mean the spacing of these perlite plates. This is spacing from one plate to the next plate, that is called the perlite spacing. And depending on the coarse is of course a relative term, but depending on whether this spacing is very large, we will call it coarse perlite. If this is very less, we will call it fine perlite. So A, which is having the lowest hardness, we are saying that in the microstructure we are seeing coarse perlite. Then in B, we see that it is still perlite, but it is fine perlite. This is quite interesting. So both are giving us perlite, but in one case the perlite lamellae are thinner and finer, in one case they are coarser, and this itself is capable of giving us a hardness value change by a factor of 2. This is an extremely interesting thing, and this is in some sense central to entire material science, that in the same composition you can have different properties depending on the control of the microstructure by different microstructures. In C, you have a microstructure which we call bainite. Now you have not met it as yet. We will have time to discuss this. For the moment, I am just writing this, the name bainite. So this is a different microstructure from perlite altogether. We will discuss that as we go along. Then in D, there is still a newer microstructure which we call tempered martensite. And finally, E is martensite. Now you can see in the phase diagram, we never came across any such phase named bainite or martensite or tempered martensite. The phase diagram will not be able to help us in identifying these microstructures. And this is because in the phase diagram, we are only able to show the microstructures which are obtainable by equilibrium cooling, which means very slow cooling, because phase diagrams are equilibrium diagrams, so they show only equilibrium or near equilibrium microstructures. So if we cool fast, or if we take the system away from equilibrium transition, then we expect to get different microstructures, and this is the result by which we get bainite, tempered martensite and martensite. How are we able to produce these different microstructures? So that's a process which is given the name heat treatment. So in the same steel of 0.8% carbon, we are able to produce different microstructures and get different properties, different hardnesses, because we have given different heat treatments. So coarse perlite is obtained by a heat treatment called annealing. Fine perlite by a heat treatment called normalizing. Bainite by a heat treatment called austempering. tempered martensite by a process called tempering. And finally, martensite by a heat treatment called quenching. We will discuss all these heat treatments as we go along. So don't worry, you are not familiar with these names already. So annealing, normalizing, Ostempering, tempering, and quenching are different heat treatments which can produce different microstructures in the same steel of 0.8% carbon with hardness value going from 15 to 65. This is indeed extremely dramatic. This effect is very, very dramatic because the property, the hardness, the mechanical property is highly sensitive to structure. And usually we feel that a certain composition will give us certain property, but in this case the hardness, the mechanical property of hardness is very, very sensitive not only to the composition but also to the microstructure produced. The microstructure property dependence is central to material science, and in this sense this slide is very, very important, which is telling you it's not only the composition but also the treatment and the microstructure which is produced by the treatment is very, very important in determining the final property. And you can see that hardness is a very structure sensitive property. There are properties, for example, if we talk about the density, densities of these steels will not be very different. The density is more or less dependent on the composition of material. But here is a property, particularly mechanical property, even electrical property. Some of these properties are highly structure sensitive, and they will depend on the microstructure which have produced, and thus will depend upon the processing history. So let us look at what exactly is meant by this term heat treatment. In fact, heat treatment is a very, very simple process. It's simply heating a material, as the name suggests, to a temperature, holding it at that temperature for a period of time, followed by cooling at a specified rate, called heat treatment. So it's nothing more than what the name suggests. It is heating a material and then keeping it at that temperature for some time and then cooling it back. And this, so all these processes are essentially that: heating, holding, and cooling. So you can see, thus just by the simple treatment of heating, holding, and cooling, we can produce different microstructures and different properties. Let us try to see how we put these different heat treatments in the temperature time diagram. So I keep the y-axis as the temperature, the x-axis as time. And so let us initially, steel is heated some temperature and then cooled. So for steel, the heating and the holding is same for all these different treatments which we named here: annealing, normalizing, Ostempering, tempering, and quenching. But essentially how you cool, that's what controls these different heat treatment. If the cooling is very slow, let me show a slow cooling. So it's a slow cooling, and that's what is called annealing. Slow cooling. In fact, it's so slow that it is called furnace cooling. Which means you simply switch off the furnace and don't take out your sample from the furnace. So it will cool along with the furnace, and the cooling will be very, very slow. This is what the heat treatment which gives you post perlite. Then you have normalizing.
With just 2 of them. The second game that we're testing with is, of course, Wolfenstein Youngblood, and here DLSS has a far less significant impact on performance, and that's because frame rates are already very high to begin with. DLSS 2.0 still takes a certain amount of time to compute, and this overhead creates a bit of a bottleneck for higher-end GPUs, or in games that don't require loads of rendering power such as Youngblood. Even so, we're still seeing a 17% performance uplift for the 2070 Super, and given we're not seeing any noticeable reduction in image quality, in fact under close scrutiny Tim says it's exactly the same, so given that I think this is still a very good result. It also means whereas the 2060 Super was slow on the 5700 XT without DLSS, enabling it allows the GeForce GPU to take the lead by a 15% margin. It also means the 2070 Super is now 37% faster, so another convincing win here for the green team with DLSS enabled. Taking into account those big DLSS enabled gains in Wolfenstein Youngblood and Control, we see that the 5700 XT is now 9% slower on average, so just a 2% difference. This means for DLSS to really cripple AMD and have a meaningful impact for RTX owners, Nvidia really needs to drastically improve game support, and we're not sure when or if that's going to happen. So for now, it is an impressive technology that works well in the games that we've tested, but given it was implemented
For the longest time, Intel reigned supreme, all the way from the highest power workstation and gaming rigs to the tiny power-sipping chips that you'd find in an ultra-portable laptop. Fortunately for consumers, AMD got their crap together a couple of years ago, bringing the world Ryzen, a return to at least competitiveness on the consumer desktop and even the high-end workstation. But one area where Intel was on top, that is until very, very recently, was super small PCs with their NUC, or next unit of computing lineup, which possibly changes, I can't get my hand on this, today. This is what appears to be one of the very first AMD Ryzen-based NUCs. It's tiny, it's light, and I have very high expectations. Just like you have very high expectations of my segues to waterproof. Reserve on Indiegogo was like, what a weird number, like $13,500 or something like that. They ended up raising over 400 grand. So why don't we do a quick unboxing and have a look at what we get inside. So we've got a VESA compatible mount, so you can pop one of these on the back of your monitor if you want like an AIO look to your setup. We've got, wow, really? Apparently it includes what appears to be a little Bluetooth keyboard. So the receiver just tucks into the back, you plug that puppy in. If you wanted to use this as like a media PC, for example, this would be great. I have something very similar at home. It appears that there's left and right click on here. Is this an Air mouse too?
I'm not sure, but it only came for like the early backers.
Oh, only the early backers get this?
Yeah.
I'm jazzed to try this because mine is super bulky. It's one from Sedeco and I haven't been able to find an alternative to it yet. You also get a power brick, HDMI cable. That is a really short HDMI cable. That is a pinner HDMI cable. I mean, I guess it's good enough to go from a VESA mount to the bottom of the monitor, but that's about it, ladies and gentlemen. You get an equally pinner DisplayPort cable. I'm bringing back pinner, you know that, right?
It's just because you're a pinner.
Hey, there's no shame in being pinner. You've also got a USB Type A to Micro B charging cable for that included keyboard. I kind of inadvertently showed you guys how easy it is to get access to the internals, but let's take a tour of the outside first. On the front, we've got our power button, we've got a headphone jack, 2 Type A USB 3s. Now this one, according to the Indiegogo page anyway, is 10 gig, and this one's 5 gig, but this one provides power even when it's sleeping, but it used to be color-coded yellow like those normally are. Now it's not, so I don't really know what the deal is with that. We've got a Type C running at 10 gig, and then nothing on this side, nothing on this side. I keep accidentally popping that top off. And then over on the back, we've got a couple more 10 gigabit per second USB 3s, DisplayPort, HDMI, dual gigabit LAN, and power in. Okay, so that gives us a total of actually apparently this front USB Type-C can be used as a display output, so that's 3 outputs. And because it's got dual LAN ports, one of the use cases that they advertise for it is actually as like a pfSense box, although personally I think I'd feel kind of limited by something like this. Anyway, let's formally open it up now. You've got 2 clicky doodads right here, and you just pop it off like that. That reveals, looks like we've got a SATA drive connector right here. It's not immediately apparent to me exactly where that's gonna mount to. To the bottom of the lid. 2 SODIMM memory slots for dual channel DDR4, as well as an M.2 slot over here. Now what I can't immediately see is the cooling solution and socket for the CPU, or rather I should just say the BGA solder point to the CPU. Reveal your secrets! Oh, no, I didn't quite have it removed there. Secrets! Oh, it's plugged in, it's probably not best. Reveal them! Why is this not coming off? Oh, I see. So there's probably some clips or something for this back part here. Oop. Oh! Hey, wow, that was awesome. Knocked that screw right into the parts tray. That's some advanced dropping technique right there. Oh my goodness. Why? Is this screwed in from the other side? Why? Maybe I overcomplicated things for myself. You know what, I bet I didn't see these screws because there was memory in the way. There they are. Way to go, Linus. See? The whole thing would have just popped off like that. I blame Jake. This seems to be a VRM heatsink of some sort. So let's go ahead and pop that puppy off. There we go. Oh, interesting. Well, I mangled the bejesus out of that thermal pad, so that's cool. But yes, that is in fact what that was for, so that's good. And you know what? let's just pop the M.2 out. Like, who needs this thing to ever boot up again anyway, right? Ba-dump.
We do.
And ba-dump. Okay. Yeah, we haven't really done the video yet, so that's challenging. Wow, why does it have these little rubbers on the M.2 stick here? I don't like rubbers on my stick.
Does anyone?
Don't appreciate it. Exactly. Well, they have an operation for that. Let's give you the rundown here. It's available in 2 configurations with 256 gigs of storage and 8 gigs of RAM for $429. That's early bird pricing though, so we have no idea how that's gonna shake out to regular pricing, or double that for, I think it's, $529. Now we do have some concerns. This is a SATA drive, so it's M.2, but you can tell by the keying that that's a SATA M.2, not an NVMe drive. They have gotten that feedback though, and apparently the newer ones are gonna be NVMe. As for RAM, unfortunately the 8 gig configuration ships with a single stick, so you're not running in dual channel, which means you kinda have to go with the higher end one if you want the full performance. Speaking of full performance, as we all know, Ryzen benefits from higher memory speed in a big way. Unfortunately, not only is this 2400 megahertz RAM, but we actually tried installing some higher speed stuff that we had lying around at the office, and the BIOS seemed to still be locked to 2400 megahertz. So we'll see how that works out for us when we do our performance testing later. Oh, nice. So we got AX Wi-Fi. So that's Wi-Fi 6 in there. That's pretty sweet. Hey, they took the Gamers Nexus approach to thermal compound. You can't have too much, so don't even try. I have no idea which screws go where anymore. This is quite disassembled. Now we get our first look at the Ryzen 5 3550H APU that's installed in the system. Now, don't let AMD's confusing naming scheme mislead you here. Even though this is a 3000 series Ryzen, it is not Zen 2. It is unfortunately Zen Plus. Don't feel bad though if you didn't know that right off the hop. I too was bamboozled. The fact that I thought this was Zen 2 was one of the main reasons that I was so excited to check this thing out. So it's not 7 nanometer, it's 12 nanometer. Everything is PCI Express Gen 3 and all of that good stuff. With that said, this is still an utterly unique product and one that I really wanted to look at just because it's finally an AMD alternative to Intel's NUC lineup. Now we can go ahead and put this puppy back together. With it mostly reassembled, all that remains is to pop in some dual channel memory so that we're giving it its best chance possible, as well as throw in some more storage so that we've got room for all of our, games about warfare that's very modern and all that kind of good stuff. So we'll pop that in there. Now, one of the things you might have noticed about that cooling solution as we were looking at it was that it's pretty darn robust. By default, AMD specs this particular CPU for 15 watts TDP, but it can be configured to up to 35, and that is apparently the route that Minis Forum has gone. Now, we're still not expecting it to compete with a Zen 2 based CPU, and ASUS actually has some sort of NUC competitors based on Zen 2 that are probably gonna beat the stuffing out of this thing, but I wanna give it a shot anyway, just because, hey, first out of the gate, all right? Got our screen capture working, which involved poking around in Radeon software a little bit, but yes, Radeon software, that's right, my friends. It's a NUC-alike. Hey, can we call them that? NUC-alikes? That's not bad. That's not bad. It's a NUC-alike running Radeon graphics. Now, Intel actually did a NUC with AMD graphics in it a while back, but this is different and unfortunately not as powerful. These are Vega 8 graphics and they are clocked at around 1200 megahertz. And our expectations are basically that we should get a pretty solid experience in esports titles, but beyond that, probably not that amazing. While performance, as we expected, is not, jaw-dropping or anything, to their credit, it's not loud. Like, that's very reasonable for a mini PC, and check this out. The whole strategy of more than doubling the suggested TDP from AMD seems to be working out pretty good. 3.36 gigahertz at 100% load across all cores. 1667 points puts us right in range of a mobile Skylake Core i7, so that's pretty respectable, but well behind even a quad-core, desktop CPU from that generation. A little unfortunate, but maybe we'll make up some ground in, let's say, Rocket League. I mean, obviously this is not a gaming-oriented product, but, it's got Radeon graphics compared to Intel on board, so 1080, texture detail, high performance, world detail, high quality, most stuff turned on, but not everything. Okay, sure, yeah. Let's see, let's give it a shot, right? Okay, so we're getting anywhere from around 30 to 40 FPS. Not bad.
So like game console territory.
Yeah. Ah, look at that. Oh yeah. I mean, obviously it's not amazing, but like if you'd showed me this like, you know, 10 years ago, I'd have been like, of course, just because it's quiet doesn't necessarily mean that the thermal performance is good. So I want to take a look at what our CPU temps are like when we're hitting it hard. Okay, that's respectable. 80 degrees. I mean, obviously it's not like my favorite thing in the world to have a CPU running at 80 degrees, but it's not like you're water cooling the thing in here, and given how quiet it is, not bad. Not bad minis for them. Is that how you're supposed to pronounce it?
Minis, I don't know.
I don't even know. If it can play Valorant, I'll be pretty happy with that. Okay.